Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and I'm joined by Drs. Rod Rosenblatt, Scott Keith, Adam Francisco, and our guest today, Dr. Dan Dean. Dr. Dan Dean has been on the show before. He came on during our apologetics series to talk about philosophical apologetics, which was a good help for us. We did a lot of the evidential stuff, but you came in and kind of wrapped up the foundation, I guess, that started with philosophy.
Yeah, classical apologetics.
Yeah. So, and that was good to have you on the show. So today we're going to have you back to talk about Thomas Aquinas. And I thought that was a good overlap because you kind of laid out the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas on the show for us briefly in the apologetics series. So we're having you back to kind of talk about at least dip into the philosophical importance of Aquinas and some of the history there.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you're listening to the show, we are now 5 or 6 episodes into our series on great thinkers of the Christian faith.
And you're probably very confused because last week we dropped an episode on Luther.
Yeah.
And this week we're going back to Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, so just a reminder to listeners that this isn't a chronological series, that this is guest-based. It's based on pretty much when we can get people to come out, and when we have guests here who can do particular topics, we go for it. Like the episode before this one was Donovan Riley on Luther.
Interesting episode, too. Didn't turn out the way I thought, but I think it was pretty good. I've gotten some good feedback on it. Early Luther is what we did.
Yeah, early Luther, and that was an excellent episode. And, 1517 has events going on and speakers coming in and out, so you'll notice some jumps and some characters who have never been on the show before coming in and out. So look forward to more episodes like that as we go along. So without further ado, maybe Dr. Keith, you could give a short introduction, let Dan introduce himself again for the listeners, and then we'll hop into Aquinas.
Sure. Dr. Dan Dean, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Concordia University in Irvine, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, thinking fellow. He's part of 1517. He blogs for us when he can, when he has the time. He has a very robust teaching schedule at the university, so it makes it a little difficult to write.
And a robust home life.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Perhaps even more robust.
But I think it's significant where and under whom you got your PhD.
So tell us.
Yeah. Yeah, so the PhD was at Florida State University, and I worked with a philosopher of biology who ended up getting really interested in science-religion discussion. And he's a well-known agnostic/atheist back in the days of the Arkansas McLean trial, which was one of the original kind of creationist evolutionist battles in the state court for whether or not we can teach this stuff like creationism in school or whatever. He was an expert witness for the ACLU on the atheist side. And so I applied to Florida State because of him, wanting to kind of work with him just to get get exposed completely and utterly to that kind of other side of the coin when we're talking about things in terms of science and religion, because he is, while he's friendly to religion, he's definitely not on team or pro or any.
He's looked to with great respect within the community interested in such things.
Right.
Secular, unbelieving, however you want to say it, they consider him one of their most significant figures. And I think it's highly significant that under him you won the PhD.
Yes, it was a lot of fun. I mean, I think I've said this. I might have said this in the last episode, but if there was a secular version of kind of Rod, Roos gets pretty darn close to it. I mean, his students, we spend more time at his house than we probably actually do at the university, and all the conversations that happen at the house over beers and bratwursts and and
other things
right? And philosophers and he just knows so many people. So philosophers, historians, scientists. I mean, I met E.O. Wilson. I talked with E.O. Wilson, the founder of sociobiology. I got to sit down and have a conversation with E.O. Wilson. That would not have happened had I not been just one day at Michael Roos's backyard, right, when E.O. Wilson stopped by to say hi.
Is he the guy on, what was that show, Expelled, where he says he says that life came to Earth maybe on the backs of crystals or something?
That's right.
Like that.
So here's here's the downside to
on
being,
the backs of crystals.
Here's the downside. He was actually pretty upset about that because here he thought he was having a really nice conversation with Ben Stein, and then they edited it down to that just one soundbite. And here's the thing: is he's not an expert in Origen's life.
That never happens.
Right. That never happens.
Yeah.
So I asked him about it. He says, you look kind of, he's like, yeah, I know. He's like, I was kind of pissed about that because we had this long, wonderful conversation. And then he totally just took that one little that one little part where I'm not even an expert in this. I was just relaying the way people have talked about it.
Sure.
In terms of the way maybe life gets here on Earth. Like
Sure.
this is just one of the going theories.
Back in my day, it was directed panspermia. And that was in the biojournals. The theory of directed panspermia. That was given to me by a mathematician by the name of Robert Meyer.
Oh, nice.
So how does this all relate to Aquinas?
Good job, Caleb.
Yep.
Well, actually, this is great. So I'm not gonna. I mean, I'll Adam, you know a lot about this. Rod, you know a lot about it. Everyone knows. You guys know this stuff really well. But one of the driving questions, which I think is at root of our science-religion kind of conflicts that we have today, is this question of faith and reason.
Sure.
And when you get into the faith and reason dialogue, that is arguably one of the fundamental questions of the Middle Ages, right? Because in the Middle Ages, you've got a Christian world, right? Ostensibly, right? Who knows what people are believing in their hearts? I'm not even going to go down that road, but you've got a Christian world. And so they were really, as more of that Greek world was being kind of rediscovered or reintroduced through our at this time, maybe Muslim friends. I don't know. Can we say Muslim friends?
Sure.
Sure, right? As
Adam's uncomfortable.
well, I'm not going to talk about Adam's true.
No, they
never mind.
Averroes and others are bringing, or you've got commentaries on Aristotle coming in through Spain and translated out of Arabic into Latin, making their way into the University of Paris. Aristotle, not himself, but Aristotle's works that were preserved in Arabic, not all of them, but most of them, are translated out of Latin out of Arabic into Latin.
So,
but the Arabic translations are an Islamization of Aristotle. So when they're translated into Latin, there's this, at least the perception was that there's an Islamic bent. These are Islamic interpretations of Aristotle, but people gulp Aristotle.
Well, otherwise we would have lost him completely, would we not?
There's about 3 or 4, maybe 5 works that were preserved by Boethius and others in the early Middle Ages.
I heard 4 is what I
But the big ones, like his Metaphysics, that wasn't preserved in Europe. It comes in via the Arab Muslim world. So our Muslim friends, but I don't.
Now you mentioned this, just for my own edification here. You mentioned that they were translated out of Arabic back into Latin. So do we have any of those original Latin?
No,
Greek?
Well, they'd have been Greek, right?
It was Greek to Arabic in Baghdad in the 9th century, late 8th and mid 9th century, and then out of Arabic into Latin. So not back into Latin.
Right. Okay.
I misspoke there. All right. Thanks for airing that.
I was just curious because I hadn't thought about that kind of issues of translation.
Yeah, it's interesting with a lot of the classical works. You have transmission issues, right? And that's one of them. Is are you dealing with something that was written in one language, translated into another, and then discovered in that second language, and then translated into Latin. At which time now we have it translated into maybe English.
Can I offer some bibliographic sources if we're going to do anything theological?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it.
For those of us not in the Roman stream, and for whom St. Thomas, we know he's a colossus, but we're not really sure where to start or how. We've usually had to read in an anthology his proofs for the existence of God. But to begin with, there was a marvelous issue intended to school people like us on the basics. And it was Christian history and biography, then called just Christian history. These are still purchasable and to some extent findable digitally through Christianity Today. I'm not sure of the extent of it, but there was an issue of Christian history devoted to St. Thomas and written for people like us. Something about the era, a lot about the man, something about introduction to the Summa Contra Gentiles, introduction to the Summa Theologica for outsiders or beginners or Protestants or know-nothings or whatever you call us. That can still be purchased. That one issue can still be purchased in paper.
Right.
If you find the right place. That, I would say, is a wonderful start.
Right.
And you said that was Christianity Today?
Well, yeah, Christian history was underneath the banner of Christianity Today. It no longer published.
Okay. I'll go. I know they have a full archive online of everything they've done, so I'll go check that website, and if that's available digitally, I'll include the link in the show.
Or just check your text. You can do that too.
Oh, look at you!
There you go.
Wow, one step ahead.
Then a couple of others. There was an article written, again, for beginners by MacDonald, evangelical scholar, H. Dermot MacDonald, and he wrote it in a publication called Great Leaders of the Christian Church. That's intended for people like us who are asking theological questions of Thomas. Then I'm going to say this, and everybody will sort of smile. An introductory article by Norman Geisler. Norman Geisler is a confessing Baptist and a total fan of St. Thomas Aquinas. An odd sort of combo, but for years, even when I had him at Trinity and we all thought we were going to die taking his course on St. Thomas, because what he was doing was attending Loyola Chicago and then coming back to lecture to us on St. Thomas. And none of us had the background to be able to follow, at least not quickly. And we all thought we were going to die. But Geisler is nobody's fool on this. He's a Baptist who's taken with St. Thomas philosophically. So you need to know that. But if anybody understands me taking a shot at Dr. Geisler here, I'm not. I'm actually sort of recommending that he's one source you can go to in a few pages to introduce what this is all about. One more, a guy who's a convert to Rome. It looks like his name is pronounced Kreeft, but he's a Dutchman, and I think the correct pronunciation is Kreft.
Peter Kreft.
Peter Kreft. And he is very interested in people like you and me and others examining the works of St. Thomas and wants to help us to do it. Oh, does he want us to convert? Of course he wants to convert us to convert. I mean, he's a confessional Roman Catholic. But Kreft is one of those guys who says, let me help you.
One more on this is a guy who's contemporary as well, who teaches out at Pasadena City College. So he's teaching at a junior college, which tells me that he's used to bringing this down to a very kind of non-academic level. Is a guy named Ed Fesser.
Oh, yes.
And
F-E-S-E-R.
That's right. Now, if you go to his blog, he's got a blog, you can go over there. I have trouble following him in the blog. His intellect is solid, and he's a full-blown neo-Thomist and will defend it to the death, that this is the only way to kind of understand Christ and culture, Christianity, faith and reason, and the kind of the theological worldview that is necessary so that we can thrive as a society and as a person.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. He's a good writer.
Yeah, he is, and I know he's got introductions. So I imagine I get worried about recommending things without having read them, but I imagine Edward Fesser on his introduction to Aquinas is probably pretty darn good.
I was first drawn to him when he wrote an essay on why the left always rules the universities. And it was a great essay. Anyway, those are sources that I think people like us, who are just looking for the beginnings of an introduction into the world of it, I think can use.
Great. So, Adam, you were talking before the show that you know more about Aquinas than you led on to before we got into this episode. So maybe you could give us about a 7-8 minute introduction into the early background and history of Aquinas.
I'm going to come out of the closet here and say I'm kind of a historically considered kind of a fan.
Are you a historical neo-Thomist?
Yeah.
Sinner.
So you're separating
Mostly
yourself
because I think the guy
theologically.
is mostly just because he's significant.
And boy, is he ever.
And has influenced Western thought, at least half of Western thought for centuries. So the historian in me especially the historian in me who looks at the history of ideas, we always latch on to people who have been influential.
Sure.
Not that their ideas are something that we take on, but you got to wrestle with them if you want to understand Western thought. So Just a quick bio, shooting from the hip here. He's born 1224, 1225 AD, obviously, and will live. Oh, you've got him right in front of me. Oh.
Wow. Thanks.
Lives until 1274. His early life, we don't know a whole lot about, especially his early life, but we do know that when he's in his late teens, he's raised in a fairly wealthy, if you will, aristocratic family in Italy. When he's 17 or 18, he tells his family, his mother in particular, Theodora, that he wants to join the Dominican order. And
Is this going to be another mother episode? Let's
not make it.
Like our Augustine episode.
Mom
We
is
could have named that one Augustine's mom.
right.
Yeah.
Mom's actually the good guy in this one though, because she kind of calms the family down. Because again,
Well, she arranges for his kidnapping. The story, it's not entirely clear, but
Right.
he wants to join the Dominican order. His family wants him to go into some sort of military vocation, or at least something that's going to keep the property in the family and so on. And they arrange for his kidnapping and basically lock him in a castle for a year so that he'll hopefully change his mind. And now he's not imprisoned or anything. He's studying in the castle, and over the course of a year, he's actually more convinced that he should be a Dominican. Now, in the 13th century, that's a pretty serious decision. The Dominican order was, you're reading or talking to a Dominican when they have OP after their name, Order of Preachers, and they are a monastic order established for the purpose of combating heresy in the Middle Ages in the context of the Crusades and the Inquisition. So they are, intellectually speaking, before the Jesuits come around, they are the premier intellectual order. So anyway, he's 18, 19 years of age, and finally, after his year
Well, in fact,
confinement,
the Blackfriars, the Dominican edition of Aquinas' works, is it's the premier edition.
Yeah.
Right.
And really, if you go, for example, in Oxford, there's the Blackfriars House, I think it's called, and they have public lectures and so on.
Aquinas Institute.
Yeah, it is going there as a Lutheran. There's so much to learn. They are intellectual powerhouses.
Yep.
Steeped in Aristotelian philosophy.
I spent 5 days at the Aquinas Institute that they host there at Blackfriars, and it was eye-opening, to say the least.
Metaphysicians par excellence. If there is a metaphysician, that's excellent. Dan Dean would disagree.
So would I.
In addition to an order created to combat heresy, they also were kind of parallel to the Franciscan order, a missionary order. There are some tremendous, historically speaking, Dominican missionaries, very brave men, like a guy named Ricoldo de Monte de Croica, who Luther will actually translate out of Latin into German, his work against the Quran as an apologetic missionary.
That's why he knows the name.
yeah, there it is.
So Ricoldo is a student, not physically speaking, but in terms of learning from, drank deeply from the well of Thomas Aquinas, in particular his Summa contra Gentiles, his summation against the Gentiles, and uses Thomas's philosophy and applies it to Islam, and it basically answers the question, what's the common ground a Christian missionary, and in the case of Ricoldo, who goes to Baghdad alone in the 13th century, late 13th century, growing a beard the whole way, taking on the look of a Muslim, and just anonymously enters the city, goes to a Muslim seminary basically, and learns from them, learns Arabic, and then one day gets up and starts preaching and gets his rear end beat, kicked out of the city, and he waits a while, goes around to the other side of the city. Baghdad was huge at that time, still is, but and goes back and tries it again on, I think, the southern side of the city. So he's emboldened theologically by the metaphysics, if you will, the apologetics of Thomas Aquinas. So back to Thomas, he's 18, 19 years of age, and he's given a year to think about his desire to join the Dominican order, and he doesn't change his mind. In fact, he's more convinced, and you could say kind of the rest is history. He will go on and learn from Albert the Great, one of the premier Dominican and and Aristotelian scholars of the age, and he will move around between Naples and Paris and up in Germany for a bit, but most of his activity, theological and scholarly activity, is done at the University of Paris. And it's there that he'll obviously write a lot, but what he's especially remembered for is his entering into a debate that breaks loose in the university and this is going to make it very simplistic, so if there are any medievalists listening, just chill out. I
have to say that all the time to historians when I'm teaching. I think historians in the room just chill out.
I don't know my dates.
Well, it's like when I go into a classroom, basically my history is just making stuff up as I go along, but it's always scary because people have Google and they can check facts. So I say, hey, let's just
chill out. I'm telling a story here, all right?
Facts don't matter, bros. Anyway, he's at the University of Paris as Aristotle is, a couple decades into the entrance of the Aristotelian corpus. And you have a split amongst the faculty at the University of Paris. You have the arts faculty, so we might call it the humanities or the liberal arts faculty today, who take Aristotle as an authority on all things. And then you have the theology faculty who mostly are pushing against that. They see Aristotle, especially as he's understood through the commentaries of Ibn Rushd or Averroes, this Muslim philosopher. They see it as a threat to Christian orthodoxy. So a fight breaks out, not a physical fight, but an academic fight between those two faculties. And to make it a long story short, Aquinas Thomas steps in and kind of reconciles the two. He makes the cliche we use, and I think it is a cliche because it's not entirely accurate, but he kind of baptizes Aristotle's philosophy and shows that Aristotle can be used, certainly ministerially, but the allegation, and I think it's not too far off, is that he actually elevates Aristotle and interprets Christian theology through an Aristotelian lens.
And that's become a standard sort of open question ever since.
Absolutely.
It's very clear, though, I think probably Luther's actual reading of St. Thomas wasn't that great.
Right.
His reading of other scholastics was.
Yeah.
And it's no doubt which side of that fight he was on. Sorry.
Yeah. That's dead on. And what's really at stake here is not just the use of Aristotle in the university, but a kind of a philosophy comes out of this whole debate. The arts faculty were saying they knew that the conclusions of Aristotle, obviously a pre-Christian pagan philosopher, didn't cohere or correspond to Christian orthodoxy. And so they come up with what's called the double truth doctrine. Now, there are earlier precedents for this, but they essentially argue, to make it simple, that truths in philosophy and horizontal things can contradict Christian truths, and both can be true.
Yep.
And Thomas's great contribution here is not to go the way of the theology faculty and say it's black and white. Thomas synthesizes it and says, actually, we can use Aristotle, but we can use him in such a way. He was actually convinced that Aristotle kind of was a pre-Christian Christian.
There were a lot of that.
There's a lot of that.
Even all the way up into like Erasmus.
And you see it in the art. The artwork.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But Thomas synthesizes it, and that's at least historically speaking, one of his great contributions in that faith, the debate over faith and reason.
Yep.
Because revealed theology is going to be the core.
Yes,
right?
Not a doubt about it.
You know, but you're going to have that idea of grace perfecting nature, and so
we've got to. I'm going to do your announcement for you, but we got to come to a break. But we should probably. Can we pick up here after the break? Because I've got a lot more. It's going to be one of those episodes where I say a lot.
He's going.
Sorry.
Look at him go.
Yeah.
He is a closet.
Well, we're going to have to capitalize on this situation, so we are going to go to a short break, and then we'll come back with a quick ad, and then let Dr. Francisco spin up his wheels.
And Dr. Dean a little
And
bit.
Dr. Dean.
Oh, yeah. You know what? This is great.
Welcome back to the Thinking Fellows. Since Dr. Francisco has traded grunting for words, we're going to let him come back into this episode. He wanted to
That's
roll off.
permission to punch right there.
So we're going to get back on the topic here today, right away, and let you
I'm just gonna
go
go
for it.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what we were talking about before the break, but something about the context of the University of Paris and philosophical background, and the significance of Thomas in this whole debate is that even behind all that is the scholastic context, where you mentioned faith and reason earlier is like the big question. How does reason relate to faith, or vice versa?
To this day.
And to this day, and I mean,
Yeah, it goes under the guise, I think, now of science and religion more often than not.
yeah, and, I mean, the scholastic. I mean, if there is a scholastic thinker from the Middle Ages who kind of is the symbol of scholasticism, it's for most Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
And
But prior to that, it was almost solely St. Augustine.
right.
Yeah.
Right, but what you see though, like when you get into the late 11th, early 12th century, around Anselm's day and age, I don't know if have we done an episode on Anselm?
Not yet.
No, we will,
Okay.
though.
You get at least Europeans, in the universities that are starting to grow and pop up here, there, and everywhere. They're no longer comfortable because they're out of the Middle Age or the early Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages. Europe is coming into its own, and people are starting to ask questions that they didn't have time to ask before. The questions like, why do we believe what we believe? Is it all, like in the realm of theology, do we believe that, for example, God exists because mom and dad or our culture says he exists, or something like that? And you get, starting with Anselm, I'm sure that you could find earlier people, you get the question, why do we believe this? And so the issue of reason comes up. And Thomas, whatever you think about the 5 ways for God's existence that he asserts and describes in his work, he's at least asking the question, what are the rational or evidential grounds for believing in something we can't see or empirically perceive? And the way he answered them at the time was completely appropriate given the context. Now, obviously, our context has changed radically, but even so, even guys like Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion.
Sure, he's going to deal with the 5 ways.
Yeah, when he's taking on arguments for God's existence, does he use like contemporary arguments that work in our context? No, he goes after Thomas Aquinas.
Yep.
Anthony Flew, same thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
So his influence is still theologically, and before the show we were talking a little bit. I don't know if we'll do it now, but in terms of his legal thought, his political thought is still heavily influential.
Yeah. And you can see it. I mean, what you were just mentioning there is you can see, especially against Anselm, since we do have the shows in the past on apologetics, you can go check those out because we do have one there on the ontological argument, which will be Anselm's favorite, right? There was a battle kind of going on within the Catholic Church as to, are we going to go with kind of, the Aristotelians with the kind of sense experience as driving knowledge, or are we going to go with a more Platonic or Neoplatonic rationalism where the mind takes precedence over the senses, right? And whether this obviously this is a debate that's happening in the kind of academy, right? But the academy being kind of wrestling with these issues, I mean, it's going to set the stage for the world to come.
It trickles down.
It trickles down into, how do we deal with questions of whether or not Scripture is true, or can I, from nature, know that there is a God or something like that, right? It was where Aquinas was highly influential in the philosophical fields down the line, and it apparently, I mean, I'm not up to date on kind of the social aspects of law and things like that, but what you were just mentioning, that all this is going to come into and is still being debated in the realm of kind of legal philosophy and things of this nature.
Well, one of you made the remark when the microphones were off, were it not for what he did, we would have nothing but positive law.
Yep.
And that's just horrifying. Horrifying.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got there's a section in his Summation of Theology called, it's usually under the title, The Treatise on the Law, where he's using Cicero and Aristotle and others, but he kind of arranges types of law in, if you will, a system, and shows that human law, or what we call today positive law, the stuff that we write and we vote on and so on, if it's truly law and it's truly just, it has to be correspond to natural law. it has to. It has. Otherwise,
It can't just be voted on as the law,
right,
in order to be just.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, it can be. You can vote on it. You can write it down. But if it's found to be out of sync with natural law, then you should change it.
Yep.
Right.
And a little bit more on his influence. So for Martin Luther King Jr., his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he's sitting there because he was arrested for marching without a permit. I think it's 1963. And he writes a letter to clergymen who have shunned Martin Luther King. They've said, you shouldn't have done this. We're all for civil rights and so on and so forth, but you don't break the law to go or to get it, to obtain it. And King writes back this wonderful letter, and in there he says, I actually am forced to break the law in this case. And he critiques the Southern Church up and down. He says, in fact, when it comes to me breaking the law, I have every right to, in line with the great Western tradition. He quotes Augustine and Aquinas. He says, a law that does not correspond to natural law is no law at all.
Yep.
Yeah.
In fact, it must be broken.
Yep.
And that's he quotes Thomas Aquinas, and it is Thomistic to the core,
Right.
even though he was a Southern Baptist preacher.
And what is important about all this, kind of for general apologetics, and not diving deep into theology yet or something like that, but just more in that philosophical apologetic field here, is that what Thomas really did well was he argued that there is going to be common ground, whether it be in law or whether it be in intellectual kind of argument. There is going to be common ground with the Gentile, with the non-believer.
Yep.
And that little piece is so important to our kind of conversation between Christ and culture, and it's one that is so patently denied, or at least argued against, or fought against, or turned away from in our current culture.
Yep.
That, I mean, if we're gonna, not that I'm a closet Thomist like this guy over here sitting next to me, Adam.
Whatever.
I think he's been outed.
There's another one that I think it ought to be acknowledged. It's another one in St. Thomas that I can amen as if I were a Southern Baptist, and that is,
I would really like to see that one day.
that language about God is not univocal, nor is it equivocal. It's analogical.
Right. And you handed that over to me. We did some research on that and included it in Being Dad as a way of speaking
This is
analogically about the relationship between our view of earthly fathers and our view of God the Father.
Yep.
Right, and that's fascinating because he actually uses that distinction to argue against Anselm when he's going against the ontological argument in the Summa. Right, he says, "Look, Anselm, you're assuming that you can tap directly into this kind of perfect definition of God.
Good for him for opposing it,
and there's no way we can do that."
Yep.
Right,
good on him.
Nothing.
Go.
On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'm also a closet Platonist. So,
Oh God.
Oh my Lord,
no.
you are a conflicted soul.
Yeah, Lord have
It'd
mercy.
be more difficult to forgive you for that one.
And then next I read in Lewis that he was.
All right.
that's right.
All right.
So Dan, I've been I was just on a podcast talking just about the basics of evidential apologetics and things like
That's
that.
right. On the basis of our podcast on apologetics, Caleb was asked to be the guest on a podcast to talk about apologetics.
Oh, good.
Good. And it's I've been getting questions about, or statements basically saying, if you're doing evidential apologetics or something like this, when you're having conversations, you are already accepting the atheist worldview when you're.
So you were talking to a presuppositional.
Yeah.
So this is why I hate the language of worldview. I hate the language of worldview.
Yeah.
I wish we could shed that from our Christian history.
So do you think this Thomist thought is helpful here? What you were just talking about, or is this?
Well, one of the great things about it is that he's not doing it that way. That has every resemblance to deductivism. He doesn't. As an Aristotelian, he inclines to working from the factual world up.
There is nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses.
Yep.
Right.
That's Thomas Aquinas. That's also Aristotle.
Yep.
Even in his 5 ways, what you get is you get a very limited description, right? You get proofs that prove basically existence.
Yep.
of something greater than you that was the cause of things.
Yep.
And I think what's one of the things that I'm drawn to in Thomas is his you wouldn't know it by like the Summa Theologiae or something like that, which is just many pages. But even in the Analogientis, what you were describing, that God we speak about God by way of analogy. We do that because being corrupt now, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for us to accurately explain God by the use of just mere words, right? And so, by way of analogy, you can create these word pictures that more accurately can do that. And it drew me back to using something like a denotative definition to describe something. You can describe a chair all day long, but the most accurate way to create a picture of a chair in somebody's mind is just to point to one.
Yeah, and if you're looking for like an example maybe to give to kind of illustrate this, are they conceding to the secularist when they go to a doctor? Are they conceding to the secularist when they get a brain scan to find out that there's cancer in the brain?
That's good, man.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, they are. So why do we, I mean, are you becoming a secularist because you go to a normal doctor? No, of course not. Right? That's because there's enough common area that we work on the playing field with the same. We're all in the same. How about this? We're all in the same mix together, and we're trying to find our way through this, right? And if we all are created by God, then we do all have the same faculties.
Which is why you'll run into people in the world, right, with whom you have a lot of agreement on many issues.
Sure.
I'll sometimes tell the students at the university that we don't do a lot of ethics in my class, but when you get into it, one of the struggles I think Christians have with ethics, or that I have with teaching ethics from a Christian perspective, is some of the most ethical people I've known in my life were not Christian by a long shot.
Yep.
And so it's difficult, I think, for us to be prescriptive as Christians about ethics from a Christian perspective when most of what we would say is a natural law type stuff. It's common, right? It's common to the Christian and the non-Christian alike.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons that we, in our conversations, discover, again, inductively, that there are a lot of things that we do share with the pagan, and that's worth acknowledging. It is not the camel's nose coming into the tent, it's the way things are. It's not a place to have the battle. I'll stop.
So, but this is exactly illustrative of what was going on even in the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas. I mean, here we are in the 21st century, and we're struggling with the same kind of issue of faith and reason and how this all works out in my daily life, right?
So as we sort of close out this, again, we struggle. This has been our biggest struggle in this series of covering historical characters, is that we only have 45 minutes to cover people whose life's work was so instrumental to the life of the church and to the faith. But I think it'd be interesting to close on what were Thomas's major theological contributions.
I want to throw one other source in. Philip Watson, who actually taught in a Methodist seminary in Chicago, but knew his Luther really well. Philip Watson wrote a book called Let God Be God, published by our publishing houses years ago. And in that particular book, Let God Be God, there's one particular chapter called Luther as Theologian, in which he's discussing everything we've talked about these 45 minutes. And it is worth getting a hold of, just that chapter, for the footnotes and for what he's saying. That is, he said, Thomas had a doctrine of justification, along with 176 other doctrines. In other words, it wasn't anywhere near central, nowhere near it. And that's what Luther started getting into. That is, he was being driven intellectually to saying, this particular doctrine is the one that defines the whole Bible story from Genesis to Revelation. And it has to do with God having an unbelievable plan to save sinners apart from law.
Right. Yeah, so Thomas starts with God.
Yep.
And then works down. But this was going to become the central fight in the Reformation.
Yep.
Right. And Thomas becomes orthodoxy 300 years or so after he's kind of alive and doing his thing in the 13th century, which would put us right there at the Reformation.
Yep.
Right. And so Luther, while he probably said all sorts of damaging things about Aquinas, and we could argue about what intellectual things he kind of liked and didn't like or whatever, that theological one is going to be central.
Yes.
To
him
and to where the Reformation begins and ends.
Yeah.
Right.
He's going to take the thesis that Aristotle does not provide the stuff of theology. We may love him for his introduction to logic and other things, but if our seminaries start to talk as if he provides the stuff and not St. Paul, we've made a wrong turn.
Yeah. An example of this would be his doctrine of the Lord's Supper. He's not the first to do it, but he's going to really kind of fine-tune the doctrine of transubstantiation using Aristotelian language.
Right.
Using Aristotelian logic.
The forms, it looks the same, but the substance has actually been transformed with the words of institution. So, I mean, that's very much a magisterial use of Aristotle.
Right.
I would argue, anyway. But
Well, then you get it from, I think, I don't want to do mischaracterization here, but I think you get it from the Reformed in the other direction, right?
Sure.
Oh, sure.
An overarching use of reason to deny the actual bodily presence of Christ in the supper.
Yeah, he can't be. They were sort of Newtonian before Newton.
Right, he can't be in two places
Can't be in two places at once. And then you find out later on when you study it that the Reformed believer can do what Jesus can't.
In two places at once.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's always fun.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad Rod said it.
Yeah. If we're getting close to the end here and we've laid out this kind of central theological difference, right, of the Reformation, if you want to kind of follow this out then into how this might affect the kind of more philosophical again and kind of social structure of the Reformation era, a guy named Peter Harrison, a historian, has done some really marvelous work on the impact of the Reformation on the development of science.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and he argues, right? He argues, and from just fantastic. I mean, you can't. I'm not a historian. I'm a philosopher. But when I read his stuff, as he's a philosopher, I'm like, oh my God, how did you have time to read all this stuff, right? But he'll argue. He's got two theses. One.
How many kids did he have?
Probably zero. I don't know though. I'm just guessing, Peter. If you ever are listening to this, I have no idea. I've met him once, and he's a very, very, very nice guy. So I don't want to make fun of him. But he argues two things. He goes, look. The Reformation was central to the development of contemporary science because Luther and Calvin took Scripture seriously. And so what they did is the fact that they took that literal kind of interpretation of Scripture, that then allowed this kind of literal interpretation of nature, where now all of a sudden we don't have to worry about pelicans, being these kinds of creatures that pierce their breasts to feed, this Christ figure. Pelicans are just a natural system, and we can study them on their own. Right. So that turn to Scripture on its own kind of helped push forward a more empirical scientific stance away from the kind of scholastic, theological, philosophical background of Thomas. And then once we started reading Scripture, they rediscovered a robust doctrine of original sin. So it's not like Thomas Aquinas, where I'm just kind of damaged and now I can get better. And so I need indulgences, and I can even get better in the way I know there's all sorts of ways that we kind of improve ourselves, grace perfecting our natures. With that rediscovery of original sin, the next crop of kind of empirical scientists who would have probably been Thomist in an era before, right, looked and said, oh crap, I can't know anything about the natural world. I have to actually go look and see what's going on in the natural world. And so this doctrine of original sin actually pushed a more empirical trend in philosophy that the outshoot was going to be people like John Locke and David Hume. Right? All these people get, these empiricists owe some of their empiricism and owe some of the social context back to this fact that original sin became a theological debate. What does that mean? And that I am fallen down to the core of my being, even into what I can say I know about the world. And he says the only response to that would be to go rationalistic, which was to kind of the Descartes, the Cartesian, let's recapture the kind of Platonic.
Indubitable truth.
Yeah, let's recapture what we kind of had in the Aquinian and the kind of Augustinian systems to a radical empiricism that basically started with, here we are, and I got a blank slate, and I got to figure stuff out.
Yeah.
Right.
You know that nobody would publish Copernicus's work
Except the Lutheran.
Luther
Yeah.
said Wittenberg will do it, and
Yep.
he wasn't a Copernican.
Nope.
But he said Wittenberg will publish it.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of describes something of the ethos. It was the Lutherans, Kepler, Brea, others, who were doing some of the mathematics of this early in the game, but it wasn't by accident they were Lutherans.
Mm-hmm.
The Dutch weren't interested.
Nope. Yep. So,
All right. Thank you for listening to this show.
Thanks for coming on, Dan.
Yeah.
thanks for having me. It's always fun being here.
Before we go, we didn't do a break today. We were
So excited about
we were on such a
Aquinas,
roll
we just went.
that we went for it. But before we go, I wanted to update the listeners about a couple things. We have some really awesome listeners because I've been checking lately, and if you search the names of any of the figures that we've covered so far, we show up as the number one on the iTunes podcast. So if you search Augustine, thank you, fellows. Is
I'm gonna do that right
what
now,
pops
by the way.
up. Yeah, if you search Johann Arndt, if you search Gresham Machen, those are who pop up. Our name on Luther was an introduction, episode 1 on Luther, so it's not first because of the tagging system, but it's still on the first page there too. So we have some great listeners who have been pushing the show, sharing it with their friends who have gotten us some of this going on. So you look perplexed.
No, let's go. Go.
Okay. So thank you for that. We've also been getting a lot of listener questions into the email. So if you're listening to this episode and I haven't responded to you or somebody hasn't gotten to you, that's because we're getting a lot more volume and it's taking a little while to respond. So hold on. We are good about trying to get back to you within.
I think we've done okay,
We've done great. So we get back to people within a day or two. but-
considering that we all have day jobs.
That's right. And if you found this show to be of value, please do remember that we are completely supported off of donations from listeners and people who support the mission of the show and 1517 The Legacy Project. So if this show has made an impact on you, has been a helpful resource, please consider donating to the cause, keeping the show running, helping us maintain and improve the show and get new guests on and all these other types of things.
Yeah, we really do appreciate your feedback too, by
Yes.
way of the
Yes.
emails and even the
Yes.
questions. Again, it may take us a little while to get to the questions, especially the longer ones.
Yeah.
But we do appreciate them. It lets us know where we're on track and where we're off track.
Yep.
And what we've covered in sufficient detail and what we have not covered in sufficient detail.
Yep. So thank you. So we're going to catch you next time. We're going to stick in this series and look out for another great thinker of the Christian faith out of chronological order.
Bye-bye.
Bye.